All right. So last week, we had a little bit of discussion on trying to understand what what the sacrificial system is, and how does that relate to Jesus, and what the connection between the Old Testament or the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and how it connects with each other, right? And then we called it, the how the whole Bible is, and they have this common thread to it, which is the covenant of God, which is the covenant of God towards His people, and it's seen there in plain sight. It's seen there in plain sight, where in the word testament actually means covenant. So the old covenant and the new covenant, or a better phrasing would be the older covenant and the newer covenant, uh, which kind of tells you that the covenant itself is not rendered completely useless or obsolete, but it is a continuation, and Jesus made it into a better version of what it's supposed to be. So here, that's why we call this the covenant continues with Jesus, right? So now we start off by understanding the covenant that started with Abraham, and then the Israelites stayed in Egypt for 400 years as slaves. Now I read some Jewish notes and some rabbis who would look at this, and they would look at it from a different perspective, and they said, the Israelites coming to Egypt, though they became slaves, was not entirely bad from the perspective of the way times were at that time, because it was very, it was a very trying, whether you're on that schedule, it's very difficult, or it's very challenging to live by that. And they said, I don't think our people, the Jews, would have our people, the Jews, would have what's called flourished as much as they if they were not in Egypt. Because when they were in Egypt, they were under the protection of Egypt. Even though they were slaves, they were under the protection from other nations. So Egypt protected Israel, quote unquote protected, and that allowed them to balloon their number to about 600,000. Okay, so in some ways, some Jews did believe this, and they said this is still God's way of protecting His people. So, so this is exactly what I just said. Okay, but after 400 years, you'd think and you'd wonder, 400 years before the Exodus, you all see them smiling here in this picture, which might not be the case. It's not fun to be uprooted from where you used to live, right? But um here's a picture, but the question comes in: 400 years in Egypt, what god do you think they'll be worshiping? Do you think they'll be worshiping Yahweh? you know all right, guys, sorry, I have to do this. Give me about 5-7 minutes. I have to close the door because Veronica's gonna leave and nobody's gonna so give me about 5 minutes, okay? Sorry.
Okay.
Joris,
Yeah.
did you come yesterday
Yesterday. Yeah.
in the morning?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't come. I joined.
Yeah, you joined.
Uh,
How many people?
I think yesterday was it's Isaac, Jason, four of us. Yeah, with Nick and myself.
Okay. Yeah, I really got a bad sore throat.
Regular sore throat or COVID sore throat?
Bad sore throat. I mean, like really itchy right now.
How do you tell the difference between regular and COVID?
No, it's just something
Well,
that, nowadays you just have to ask that, right?
yeah, I mean, like I didn't get any fever, just and I didn't check.
It seems the latest strain, yeah, you don't really get fever. Some people just got sore throat and then yeah, they were positive. So I don't know, man.
Well, from my experience, COVID sore throat is itchy. It doesn't it's dry, itchy, and goes on for days. Yeah, regular sore throat. After you take a cough syrup, usually you feel better. But COVID, just keep going on.
Yeah, this is keep going
Right.
on since what? Since Monday. Since since Monday.
But have you tried taking cough syrup
Uh,
or sore
yeah,
throat?
the one with pepakau is really good. Really suit me.
Mm,
You know pepakau,
yeah, yeah,
the ibu anak cough syrup.
yeah. I used to take that when I was young, but I
Mhm.
wasn't sure if it actually helped. But I like it because it's sweet.
Yeah, I like because the taste.
So now I'm the houseboy and the pool boy. But so again, going back to the question, after 400 years, what are the odds of people forgetting about the covenant that God made with Abraham? Most likely they started worshiping other gods. Oh, I'm out of breath. Ah, okay. So in Exodus 19, verse 17 to 18. So what happened here was after they set out the camp, after the whole incident of crossing the Red Sea and finding camp, then they went to the foot of Mount Sinai. And this is what happened. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it. The smoke billowed up from it like the smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. So you see, I've always said, the culture of the Hebrew culture, a lot of it has to do with images or with visualization. So when you see something like this, and since you would know, say you would hear stories from Abraham and how he cut a covenant with God, or how God cut a covenant with him, and you would kind of relate or look at the same imagery that happened when God cut a covenant with Abraham. In Genesis 15, verse 17, we read in the last lesson, after the sun had set and darkness had deepened, a smoking vessel with fiery flame passed between the split open animals. So this was saying the same description that God would that Moses used, and then that God used with Abraham. It's more of saying, I am this same God who cut a covenant with Abraham. Okay, I am the same God who told Abraham, I will your people will be my people, and I will be their God. So it was more of a calling card or an assurance that, hey, listen, you are now following a God who took you out of Egypt. This is the same God that made that promise to Abraham. So 400 years in Egypt, and you're 400 years of slaves. Your culture has changed. Everything about you as a people have changed, and now you're out of Egypt, and God needs you to be identified with Him. And before he would speak about, say, the 10 commandments and all this, God had to tell you, or God had to reintroduce Himself to you. Okay, and after Moses came down, when Moses was speaking to God in the mountain, he establishes um, a new way of showing the people, this is a covenant I'm keeping with you now. And he was cutting a covenant with the people now, not just with Abraham. So the covenant, the same thread of the covenant continues, meaning it's still gonna be God, that He will be their God, and they will be God's people. But instead of just with Abraham, God now does with the whole nation of Israel. Okay, Yahweh now has additional instructions to Moses. He then took the blood from the sacrificed animals and sprinkled it on the altar to the people after reading the commandments to them. Later, he would sprinkle on the tabernacle and then on the priest. The blood confirms the seal of God, because this was how it has always been. When you confirm a promise, you confirm a covenant. This is how you actually, in the ancient Near East, everything is sealed by blood, right? Everything is confirmed by blood. So what Moses did here, after reading the 10 Commandments, the first thing he said about the 10 Commandments is that I am your God, and you shall have no other God before me. This was not a commandment that says you are not allowed. You're not allowed to have this. What God was telling His people is that, listen, I am your God. And you have been worshiping gods of Egypt. You have been worshiping gods of other gods. That stops. You are not in the land of Egypt, because people believe that certain gods reside in certain places. So when they were out of Egypt, God had to reestablish, listen, I am your God. You are not in Egypt anymore. You are not in the land of Egypt. I will be your God in this land. Right? And they were still in Sinai. They were still wandering. So they were still wandering around the desert. So to them, that's why they were being led by the smoke during the day and the fire during the night, because they knew that the Lord's presence was with them, and they were following where God was telling them to go. So to their understanding, because of this covenant they have with God, God is with them, and God would lead them to where they need to go, to the promise that God kept with Abraham. God intended the Hebrews to approach Him the way He had always intended, through a blood sacrifice for the forgiveness of sin. That is His provision. That's His only provision. So when you look at blood sacrifices in the Bible, when you look at, say, the one we talked about, the sacrificial system, whether it's a burnt offering, whether it's a sin offering, it was understood that it was only through a blood sacrifice can you approach God, right? Because blood represents life and other things. But and this is not weird for people back then, because this is how they did it for other cultures, right? But in some ways, what you got to see and understand, or what we have to appreciate, is the fact that this does not change all the way to Jesus. This God, when they say God is the same in the Old Testament and the New Testament, that's true, because the way He approached the forgiveness of sin, or the way He approached atonement, was the same way in the old covenant and in the same way in the new covenant. Right? If we really take a look at it very clearly, there are some great parallels. Now, the old sacrificial system, and we talked about this last week, they have the sin, trespass, burnt meal, and peace offering. A lot of them required your bull, your lamb. It depends on how well you do. You know, if you're poor, you give birds like a pigeon. You would notice that in the New Testament, Mary and Joseph was not coming from wealth, because when they did a sacrifice to God, they sacrificed pigeons, right? And a lot of this are um voluntary offerings if you want if you want to reconcile with God, right? So, and you bring it to the priest. So most of the time for the offerer's work, if you would look here, you lay the animals and you kill them. If you want to have communion or you want to have reconciliation with God, you bring the offering to the priest, right? And then when the priest does things, or when the priest does it correctly, he goes back into the Holy of Holies and then comes out with his garb. But we'll talk about more about that later. Okay, so this is the new covenant sacrificial system. You know, and the sin, trespass, burnt meal, and peace offering, the sacrifice that was all offered was Jesus. Okay, the forgiveness, he didn't really need a sin offering because he didn't have sin. Okay, but when the forgiveness for sins we commit by taking on the sins himself. So this is all under the new covenant, but the common thread here is his blood. The common thread here is that the covenant is still sealed by blood, and we are sprinkled by the blood of Christ through our baptism. And we'll get to that scripture a bit later. So that's the what we talked about, the when God created the tabernacle, the priest, and the sacrificial system. Everything there was initiated by blood. Okay, so when we talk about the high priest, see here, what you see is that all this clothing that they have was still designed when God talked to Moses on the mountain, right? From the turban to the breastplate, it was all specifically designed. And in some ways, even the way the clothes were stitched, it was not made to be torn, meaning it was very strong. This reflects the glory of God to people, the beauty of it. So when the priest comes out, they know that when they come out of the Holy of Holies dressed in this garb, it means God has actually accepted the sacrifice. Okay, because the provision is, if the priest was unclean or if he did not do the sacrifice correctly, if he enters the Holy of Holies, he would die if he did not do it correctly, right? So the idea that we have when the priests all come from the line of Aaron, right? And this would be passed on from generation to generation. So God chose Aaron and his sons to serve him as priests. The priesthood was to be exclusively theirs, right? No one else could function in the priestly office. Aaron was the first high priest. Now Aaron was under the family tree of Levi, and so of course so was Moses, because they were brothers. Aaron was the first high priest. At his death, he would be succeeded by his oldest son. This way, the priesthood could only be passed down from generation to generation. Aaron's son were to begin their priestly responsibilities at the age of 30. Okay, so a priest ministry, a high priest ministry, would only start at the age of 30. At what age did Jesus start his ministry? He started at the age of 30, but he was not from the line of Aaron, right? He was not from the line of the Levites. In order for a new covenant to take effect, a new priesthood is to be ordained, but the new priesthood will still have the same duties. Okay, so what does that mean? The duties of a high priest, his most important duty was to minister to the on the Day of Atonement. If he made a mistake, the whole nation would be without forgiveness. Can you imagine that pressure on your shoulder? God gave detailed instructions to the high priest. The instructions not only told the high priest what to do, but they pointed the nation to a priest who would come as one greater than Aaron. When he came, everyone would recognize him because he would perfectly fulfill every detail of these instructions in himself. So there is prophecy that would come, and in the Bible it says a priest greater than someone greater than Moses, or someone there's a priest who would come greater than Aaron. Now, maybe people didn't really fully understand that. Maybe they thought he would do greater things. But even the priesthood of Aaron knew that their priesthood would not really last. That a new priest would come that would minister to the people, and he would fulfill the instructions perfectly in himself. After he sacrifices, the high priest, right? After he sacrificed for himself, since he is also a man, and then for the nation, he goes into the Holy of Holies. If he is not clean, he would die, meaning if he did not perform the sacrifices correctly, he would die. Your only assurance, or the people's only assurance, that your sins have been covered or forgiven was when he comes out in his priestly garb. You know, this garb. So whenever he would do a sacrifice, he would just be in his basic everyday attire, whether it's a white linen, when in his turban. He's not wearing this or highly decorated priestly garb. So so he sacrifices for himself, he sacrifices for the nation. After all the sacrifices is done, he goes into the Holy of Holies and he would intercede with God. If he did not do it correctly, he would actually die in the Holy of Holies and he would not come out. And people, of course, would feel like, oh no, but think about this. You are putting your trust that your sacrifice would be accepted by a man who sins himself. First, he has to make the correct or he has to do the sacrifice correctly, meaning he needs to really be completely honest and be humble and not miss out on whatever sins he's actually committed. If he has lied about, oh, this is what I've done, and then goes in, people believe that if he goes into the Holy of Holies, they would die, and this has happened several times. And then this is the trust you put on a person that you know is just like you, have sinned, and goes in, asks for forgiveness for you and for himself. So there is that weird, do I trust this guy? I know he was ordained, I know he was coming from the line of Aaron, but he's just like you and me. So that's why the high priest or the always pointed to a priest that would come greater than Aaron. Okay, so now we look at what happened to the high priest during Jesus' time. Okay, so in Leviticus chapter 21, this is one of the instructions that the Bible had, or Moses had for the high priest. The high priest, the one among his brothers who had the anointing oil poured on his head, and who has been ordained to wear priestly garments, must not let his hair become unkempt or tear his clothes. He must not enter a place where there is a dead body. He must not make himself unclean, even for his father and mother, nor leave the sanctuary of his God or desecrate it, because he has been dedicated by the anointing will of his God. I am the Lord. This is in Leviticus 21, right? So one of the things that actually disqualifies you as a high priest is if you do any of these things, right? One of them is you must always had a head covering. Okay, let his hair become unkempt doesn't mean you mustirapi. Your head must always be covered. That's why you for a lot of the Jews today they have the yarmulke. Okay, um, but for any one of the priests, those who are ordained as priests, um, these are some of the things that they cannot do, and one of them is to tear their clothes. The design of the priestly garment was actually designed for it not to be torn. There were stitches that are on how it was made, and people said it's actually very hard, and it takes complete strength for you to even tear your clothes. I mean, like you have to be very strong to tear it, right? Or in a really fit of rage. Okay, that's why that's why it says do not tear your clothes, because if you do, you are showing a lot of rage. You're showing a lot of you know you know when they have this image of people tearing their shirts, it's either you're hulking up, or there's anger, or it's all this, right? So that's one of the reasons why you don't tear your clothes, because if you are able to tear the priestly clothes, it means there's something driving you to tear it, right? He must not enter a place where there is a dead body. He must not make himself unclean, and all this. But one of the things that made Caiaphas, that disqualified Caiaphas as a high priest, was in Matthew 26, verse 65, when Jesus says, when he was asking Jesus to confess, tell us who you are you the Son of God? He says, you have said it. And Jesus said, then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? Now, I don't know if people noticed it that he tore his clothes, but I'm pretty sure Matthew put it in his gospel for a reason, right? Matthew was in there, but since Matthew was not in that same crowd or that, but it was enough that people noticed it and then told Matthew about it. Caiaphas tore his robe. Caiaphas tore his clothes. Okay, and this actually disqualified him as the high priest. Now, who would take his place? Okay, so now here we see Jesus as the new high priest, right? In all of the gospels, Matthew 3, actually all the four, John being in a different way of how he testified. But in Matthew 3, Mark 1, and Luke 3, they all said the same thing. A voice came down from heaven and said, this is my son whom I love, with whom I'm well pleased. Right? In John, it says, I saw the Spirit come down from heaven as a dove and remained on him. And I myself did not know him, but the one who sent me to baptize with water told me, the man whom you see the Spirit come down and remains is the one who will baptize with the Holy Spirit. I have seen and I testify that this is God's chosen one. So what does this mean? Whenever they were expecting a priest greater than Aaron, they don't know who it was. They don't know which line he's coming from. Now, people believe that, oh, he came from the line of Judah or from David. He is from the seed of David through Nathan. But the Jewish culture always looks at the lineage of the man, right? And here, after the genealogy of Jesus, in Matthew, he talks about the virgin birth. But in his baptism, it goes on and confirms that he is not exactly from that line of Judah to the man. He is from he is God's begotten son. He is coming from the line directly from God, from one part. And now the mother comes from the seed of David. That's true, and that fulfills a prophecy. But for him to be a high priest, he has to be elected by the next high priest. He has to be ordained by the actual high priest at that time. And the only one John the Baptist comes from the line of the high priest of Zechariah. Now, when Jesus came in his ministry, the high priest was Caiaphas, which was the line of Zadok, which is also from the line of Aaron. But John the Baptist came from the high priest at that time, which was Zechariah. So when John the Baptist ordained Jesus, or gave him in order for you to be ordained as a rabbi, and then of course eventually become the high priest. But John's baptism of Jesus officially made him a rabbi, which actually makes him the next high priest after the high priest finishes his office, right? So when Caiaphas tore his robe, he disqualified himself as a high priest, which means the next high priest in line, which people didn't really realize, or Matthew realized in his book, which was later on, if you would see it correctly, Jesus was the next high priest. Okay, not from the line of a man or Aaron, but from God. Jesus was a high priest after the seed of God. He was begotten of God the Father. He was very God, but also very man. He was perfectly righteous from within and knew no sin. Therefore, it was not necessary that he sacrificed for himself. So normally a priest would sacrifice for himself and then sacrifice for people. Okay, on resurrection morning, Jesus entered into that more of a perfect tabernacle in heaven. He didn't have to enter the Holy of Holies. If you remember, when he died on the cross, the curtain got torn, which divided the Holy of Holies to the rest. So Jesus would not enter to that Holy of Holies, but he would enter to the actual tabernacle, the actual Holy of Holies, which was in heaven. He went right into the heavenly Holy of Holies. It was the real high priest entering the real throne room of God with the real sacrifice himself. The real sacrifice was his own blood that he sprinkled over the mercy seat, which was the cross. With his blood, he purchased our eternal salvation. That is part of the will that he has left for us in the new covenant in his blood. So, what are the requirements of this new covenant? For one, you have to approach him. You have to approach Jesus, and then he would sprinkle his blood on you. So there is not this new covenant is not, oh, you're my people, my blood will be on you. Now this is a deciding loyalty to go to Jesus in order for that's why there's repentance, and that's why there's willingness, and that's what makes the sacrificial system all voluntary, that you have to come to him. So, and I've said this so many times, when somebody says I was born a Christian, that cannot happen. And you can say you were born or you were raised in a Christian household, but for anyone to say I was born a Christian, I was born with the blood of Christ on me, that does not happen. And people are living under a false pretense that they can be born Christians. Maybe it's this. Maybe you can be born as a Muslim, as a Hindu, as a declaration by your parents, but that does not happen with Christianity. I'm sorry to say, I'm sorry to burst people's bubble, but that's not how the sacrificial, how in some ways, quote unquote, that's not how it works, right? Our baptism is a deeper connection. Okay, in 1 Peter 3, verse 21, after Peter talks about the flood, and we'll close with this. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21, and this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience towards God. Remember, a pledge, you're coming to God. Okay, it saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. So, what does it mean? When Peter said this in his letter, he was talking about, hey, the during the flood, everything was destroyed, but everything then again was renewed. This water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. So there's a lot of connection with the way the story of Israel goes, right? They were in Egypt. They were asked to leave a land that they know for 400 years, and they cut a covenant with God. That same imagery parallels to Abraham, when after the Babel incident, he was asked to leave his hometown that was filled with pagan worship and pagan rituals, to go to a certain place and then return and then cut a covenant with God. And God cut a covenant with him, right? So in all the same things, from the way the exiles came after 70 years, and then the same thing happens in the book of Malachi. The same thing happens again during the new sacrificial system, the new covenant or the newer covenant, is that for us to come to Jesus, there has to be willingness to leave behind what we know and to come to him. Okay, to leave behind what we know, to the whether it's for ourselves or for our way of life, but to understand, and this is what I tell people: listen, if you want to come to Christ, if you want to be a better Christian, you always have to be willing to be wrong. Because the moment you're stuck in saying, oh, this is the right way, this is the only way, you equate yourselves with people who have been stuck in their ways and does not know whether what they were doing is right or wrong. Right? So here in this is what Peter was saying. Listen, this you your baptism is a pledge of a clear conscience towards God. It's a desire to be with God. Just as sure as the mercy seat was on the Ark of the Covenant, Jesus is on the throne of God. There he represents us before God the Father. He is the high priest of all who have personally accepted him as their sin offering. However, if you are not covered by his blood sacrifice, Jesus cannot represent you as your high priest. The will cannot be executed. The verdict will be guilty. You will stand before God in the great white throne of judgment. I mean, that's if you will look at that and say that's a scary thought. I don't want to be threatened. I all I want is salvation. All I want is, I want to avoid hell. I want to avoid this. People miss the point when they go to Christianity because they want to be saved. There is still that desire. I want to be under God's rule. Let me put it this way. If I said, oh, Veronica is a great cook, and that's why I married her. If she was not a great cook, I would not have married her. Okay, what does that say about me? I'm shallow. You're not appreciating the whole person. You're appreciating only what they could give. Right? What about if my wife, when I married her, she was 20 something and she was really beautiful. Now she's kind of overweight and she doesn't look like what she did when she was younger. What does that say about me? Now, put it in mind when I say, "Oh, I want to I became a Christian because I want to be saved. I want salvation." But what if salvation was not on the line? Would you still want a relationship with God? What does that say about you? Are you desiring to know God? If salvation was not on the line, would you desire to know Him? So these are questions people need to ask before they enter into a covenant with God or with Jesus. In order for His blood sacrifice to actually um, mean the correct way, it has to be approached the right way. And this is what you heard me say this: salvation is a byproduct of your relationship with God. It's not the reason why you should have a relationship with Him. And people have a hard time accepting that. Because sure, it's a thing that attracts you. Sure, maybe it might be the first thing that makes you want to come to Him. And that's fine. But if He takes it out of the table, if He removes salvation from the table, would you still want? I mean, after you've known Him, right? After you've known how great God is, and how loving He is, and what He does for you, and what He does for who you are, right? And you know all the different qualities of God, but He takes it out. Is there still uh, a better relationship out there? Does that, if my wife all of a sudden says, "Oh, I can't cook anymore because I'm too busy," should I stop loving her because she can't cook anymore? Yeah, it's a very shallow example, but it connects to the right thing. If all of a sudden, oh, uh you're a father that provides for your children, for your family, for your wife, and then all of a sudden you have an accident, and you can't provide the way you normally do, and then your family says, "Oh, I don't want to be with you anymore because you're not providing the way you used to." That's not who we are as people, but that's who we become with God. Because we have more honor than that. But somehow when it comes to God and what He offers, we tend to see it as, no, I'm only here because of salvation. And I think that needs to be seen and revisited every time we come to God, that you're here because you want to be here for Him. Now, I don't know if you heard my testimony during the man up, one of the man ups in Sentul, when Pastor Bernard asked me to speak. And one of my biggest awakening was when I went to Israel, and I went to the Garden of Gethsemane at early in the morning. And I would see exactly what Jesus saw, the city of Jerusalem. And the next day he knew he was going to be executed. And he was in such distress. And I stood there probably a few meters away from where Jesus was praying. And I would imagine him like crying and being in distress. And I was like, I wish I was there for him. It somehow the idea of salvation was not in my mind. The idea was just, I wish I was there. I wish I was there for my friend. You know, and I think what we got to understand is that's the only way the sacrifice would actually make sense, that you are there as God's people, not as people who reconciled and restored back to God, because that's his goal. You know, so um when we look at all this from the sacrificial system, and there's always parallel from the old covenant to the new covenant. And this is what we're trying to take a look at, is that okay, where do we stand in this? Where do we stand when we talk about the sacrifice of Jesus? What does it mean for you in your way of life? Okay, in your understanding of God. So we'll close it here. And you know, so I wanted this series is gonna be probably about only four or five meetings, right? But I wanted this to be more of uh if it's just us few, that we need to revisit or take another look at why we follow Christ and why we start a relationship with him and how we share Christ to other people. You know, when I was in the TCI Matthew class, uh, it's called Jesus the Messiah, and we talked about Matthew from a Jewish perspective. And I was asking them, what did they expect? You know, I want to learn how to explain why Jesus is the Messiah. And I told them, this is not gonna be that course for you, because this is not how you learn how to explain it. This is how uh, uh, this lesson is about how people started to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, you know, and why. How you explain it to other people is gonna be based on your own story, on why he's the Messiah for you. So, all right, so we'll close it there.